Kenya's stock of external bonds has increased by 57.5 billion Kenyan shillings in 10 months. This comes despite the Treasury's decision to cancel the issuance of another Eurobond due to the weak shilling. This means Kenya's debt repayments were getting more expensive, with the Controller of Budget noting that she approved payment of an additional 5.4 billion Kenyan shillings in external debt servicing in the year ended June due to a weaker local currency. Data from the National Treasury shows that the stockpile of international sovereign bond, also known as Eurobonds, increased by 7.2% to 861.5 billion Kenyan shillings this October from 804 billion Kenyan shillings in December last year. During the period, the Kenyan shilling depreciated by 7.23% from a base exchange rate of 113.14 against the dollar by the end of December last year to 121.33 in October 2022. Now, joining me from Nairobi, Kenya is an economist, Professor Iraki, and he will be opening up this discussion to help us understand what actually is the issue as regards Kenya's debt profile and, of course, the loans in the tune of Eurobonds, about 58 billion Kenyan shillings that is said to have been increasing over time. Good morning to you, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us on Business Edge.
Good morning, and how are you? This is Nairobi, very warm now. The last time we talked, it was very cold. Now it's very warm.
Well, of course, you know the way the weather changes, and we just have to roll with it. But then let's just get into the discussion and see how Kenya is rolling with the issue of its Eurobond loans. Now, many African countries have faced hard times this year. Aside from a dollar that is gathering momentum and becoming stronger by the day, what are the factors actually affecting the shillings?
It's interesting that the old government of Uhuru Kenyatta talked so much about debt, and debt was a very big issue even during the campaign. And the new government is talking about the same. I think apart from the weak sharing, or apart from the strengthening of the dollar, the other factor that is making our sharing weaker is the trade deficit. We import more than we export, and that by nature creates demand for the dollar, and the dollar appreciates against the local currency. Before that, we had the problem of political uncertainty. But I think that one we have sorted out, having peaceful and very successful elections.
All right, now, the weak shilling is one of the major reasons why Kenya canceled the issuance of another Eurobond. But then the debt stock keeps piling up. So why is that?
It's interesting because we thought we'd use the Eurobond to get cheaper loans. But then when the interest rates started going up in UK, US, and all over the world, the government decided that was not the best option to get cheap loans. They decided to get loans from the local sources, syndicated bank loans. So I think it was a good decision because in the long run, the interest rates in the West are keeping on going up. But I don't think it was made because of that. It was probably for other reasons. But with the hindsight, it was not a very bad decision.
Okay, so Professor, it's been more of a ritual now for African countries to always want to run to Eurobond loans when they're having issues paying up their debts. But then has Kenya been actually successful with its Eurobonds, looking back now?
I think that question is double-edged because we have always been debating the issue of borrowing money in this country. And the argument has been borrowing is not a problem as long as you put that money into the right use. So we had the Eurobond borrowed a few years ago. We had some money borrowed here. We had some money also borrowed from China. But I think most of the Eurobond money seems to have been put into long-term projects. And it takes time before you see the returns of such long-term projects. So maybe in a fullness of time, we can say exactly whether it was a successful project or not. But for now, the jury is still out.
So now that the Kenyan shilling has depreciated by about 7.23% against the dollar, so how is that actually affecting repayment? Because you are saying that there's no problem with having to borrow. Of course, when you borrow, you get to pay back. But then when you have to pay back at a higher cost, then paying back, the process of paying back could bring about pressure, most especially on the country's economy. So how is that actually affecting the payback system?
I think that is the problem the government never wanted to face, but it is the reality now. That the shilling has depreciated, and by extension, you have to borrow loans at a higher rate. So I think when the government was trying to get money from Eurobond, nobody knew that the shilling would depreciate to that large extent, particularly because of the war in Ukraine, because of the drought, and also because of the interest rates that have been hiked in the West, in the UK, US, and the rest of the world. So I don't think anybody foresaw those circumstances. But the reality is the shilling has depreciated, and the government has to look for another source of money to pay those debts which have accumulated because of the weakening of the Kenyan shilling.
All right, Professor, let's look at what the World Bank said in one of its reports. It actually stressed that related deficits are being financed through more debt with an increase in commercial borrowing, and that is actually responsible for debt growth. One of the reasons why debt growth would always occur. So what other options do Kenya have in terms of plugging its budget deficits?
If you are in Kenya in the last 1 or 2 years, the Kenya Revenue Authority, the government agency that collects tax on behalf of the government, has been very aggressive. In fact, in a few quarters this year, they have exceeded the budget. They have exceeded their target, which means that the government is doing all it can to improve revenue collection through taxes, probably to try and purge the deficit. The government has also been trying to reduce its spending. When President Ruto came to power, I remember him saying he is going to cut down about 300 billion in government spending. So two approaches: raise more revenue through taxes and reduce the government spending. And I think that might work in the long run.
Now, one of the consequences of this kind of growing loans and piling up of loans is that Fitch Ratings has actually downgraded Kenya's rating from B+ to B. So we'd like to know what implication that would have on the country's image and economy while it tries to offset its debts and reduce the deficits.
That's very bad news because the interest rates are raising the amount of money that are raising the cost of borrowing. Now, when our credit rating is downgraded, then the image is going to be downgraded also, and the interest rate we are going to be charged for our loans is going to go up. So the downgrading of our credit rating could not have come at our worst time. Remember, the shilling is depreciating. Remember the prices of oil, the prices because of Ukraine. So I think there is a worst time for our credit rating to be downgraded, but I'm sure the government is doing something about that.
Well, of course, the government is doing something, but then there's a deadline to that payment because by the end of June 2024, Kenya is actually expected to make a payment of about $2 billion or 245 billion Kenyan shillings for a maturing Eurobond amid what they are facing, which has to do with liquidity and, of course, the global financial tension, just as you have mentioned. So do you think that Kenya will actually be able to meet the deadline in terms of payments?
I think it would be very unfortunate if the government of Kenya is not able to pay its payment obligations. But my hunch tells me that by 2024, the government will have done its best to raise more revenues through taxes and reducing the waste. If we fail to pay our debt, particularly with downgrading, it will make our life very difficult economically, to make it very hard for us to borrow more money, and that will not be very good for our image. So I don't think the government will allow that to happen in 2024. I think we have enough time to do something before the deadline hits.
Professor Iraki, some people are actually saying that to repay the Eurobond, Kenya needs to take another kind of loan to retire the maturing one, because we need to, of course, consider the hawkish stance of most central bankers in the Northern Hemisphere as of now. So do you think that Kenya will be able to get another kind of loan if it is hoping to, of course, meet up with its debt obligations?
In the last 3 months since we got a new president, he has visited the West about 2 times. He was in US twice, visited UK. And I guess one of the things that have been discussed is how to properly deal with the economic situation in this country. So I think if we put our economic situation in order, we put our physical, our monetary policy in order, and the economy starts growing, showing signs of growing, I think there's no reason why the Western countries should not give us more money. And remember, at the same time, Kenya is being wooed by 2 countries, China and the Western countries. So I think the West might give us more money to make sure that we don't get into the Chinese orbit, which we have been for the last 10 years.
Talking about putting the economic house in order. Now, Kenya has a 38-month program with the IMF. The IMF said it is going to closely monitor this program, and that program is actually aimed at helping the country reduce debt vulnerabilities by increasing revenues, slashing spending, and ensuring economic fiscality. Now, is this program implementable, judging by antecedents and, of course, Kenyan government body language?
From the past, any policy shift that have been introduced by IMF has never been popular, because the government is told bring down the government spending. And if you have to bring down the government spending, it means, for example, curtailing some programs, maybe retrenching some government workers, and that is never very popular. So most of the IMF-induced policy shifts or programs are usually implemented half-heartedly because of the political consequences. So I believe the government is going to implement that, and is trying to do that by reducing the government deficit, by increasing the tax revenues, making sure that people pay taxes, making sure that some items that were not taxed are being taxed. But it's always a very difficult program to implement all the time because of the political implications. Nobody wants to lose jobs. No government or no leaders want to lose their votes.
All right, now, Professor, with the benefit of hindsight, was the Treasury's decision to actually cancel plans to issue 115 billion Kenyan shillings, or let's say about 1 billion Eurobond, in dollars anyway, and instead opt to borrow from a syndicate of local commercial banks, would you consider that a right step?
In the past, we have always had the interest rates from abroad through Eurobond much lower than the local interest rates. But because the interest rates in the West have been going up substantially, maybe that's why the government decided that they may as well borrow here. The other argument has been going around in circles is that when you borrow money from around here or from Kenya, the interest rate is paid to the local banks, and that money retains here. So there might be patriotic or some sentimental implications that if you borrow money here, it remains here instead of borrowing money abroad and you pay the interest rates there. So there seems to be some thinking that money is better when it is borrowed here as opposed to being borrowed from abroad.
Finally, Professor, at some point, Kenya was actually doing good in terms of debt payments to a point that its status was upgraded to a low middle income country. But then what happened? Kenya was said to have been locked out of cheap loans from multilateral institutions such as the World Bank, and even missed debt forgiveness by some major money lenders, which includes China. So would you say that the upgrade was more of a curse than a blessing to them?
And that's an interesting question, because from my perspective, I would see it as a blessing. Because by not getting such loans from other countries, from other multilateral organizations, it is going to force us to mature faster, to get more focused, to get more disciplined through our monetary or physical policy. So I think it was a blessing in disguise, because we get more focused, we start looking for money, we start borrowing money and putting it where it has the highest returns. It is like a child who has grown up and is being told, now you are old enough, can you take care of your interests? Can you pay your rents? Can you pay your bills? Can you get out of the home and start your own home? I think that is blessing in disguise, in my opinion.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's all about Kenya being financially responsible and, of course, being fiscally responsible also to their debt obligations. But now we appreciate your presence, Professor. Do have a wonderful time.
Thank you and happy holidays.
Yes, we wish you the same. Now, the accumulation of the costly dollar-denominated Eurobonds has been blamed for the spike in Kenya's debt service costs. And this is further putting pressure on Kenya's economy and image, even as the global credit rating agency Fitch downgraded the country's rating from B+ to B. So even as the loan continues to pile up, we get to see if Kenya will be able to plug the gaps and raise funds without having to put pressure on its economy to, of course, offset its debts as the months go by, because, of course, they have a deadline by June 2024, and let's see, maybe they will be able to meet up that deadline and pay up as soon as they can.